And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move on from the Roosevelt presidency. Now, the progressive era, as I told you at the outset, really is going to deal with both Republicans and Democrats. And what's more, within the parties themselves, you're going to have different wings. You're going to have more progressive elements in some cases, and you're going to have more conservative elements in some cases. But in this case, we're going to see that Teddy Roosevelt essentially is going to handpick his successor. Now, his successor is a guy by the name of William Howard Taft. They were very, very good friends. They really were seemingly of a like mind. Teddy Roosevelt felt that Taft would go through and would continue all of the work that Teddy Roosevelt had started. Don't get me wrong, yes, you could put Taft down as a progressive Republican, but at the same time, wasn't exactly the same as Teddy Roosevelt. Now, I've mentioned this before. Just because you have two people in the same party or even in the same ideology within the same party, it does not mean they're going to do everything exactly the same way. So Teddy Roosevelt thinks that he's going to have his successor be a carbon copy of him. Essentially, this is going to be Roosevelt's third term. It's just somebody else is going to be doing everything. So this is how William Howard Taft becomes our next president. The problem, however, is that while TR really thought Taft was going to be a continuation, things did not work out well, and the two actually, lost their friendship over that. You could definitely make the argument that Taft stumbled at this point in time. Okay, now as I mentioned previously, William Howard Taft was the hand-picked successor to Teddy Roosevelt. Now, the thing is, even though when he was president, he was not really happy with being president. His lifelong goal actually was to be on the Supreme Court, and more specifically to be the Chief Justice of the United States. At this point in time, you could kind of argue that while he didn't get to be Chief Justice at that point, he had to take the consolation prize of only becoming President of the United States. But he was TR's handpicked successor. Like I said, Teddy Roosevelt was of the opinion that Taft would go through, would continue everything exactly the way TR had been working on it, and would basically just continue every policy exactly the same way. Now, William Howard Taft had been Secretary of War. Now, this is a position that we do not have any longer, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the Secretary of War has become what we refer to as the Secretary of Defense. It changed after World War II. Secretary of War is actually a position that goes back to legitimately the first cabinet under Washington. And you think about it, this is a pretty important job. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt is responsible for the Panama Canal. He's responsible for sending the Great White Fleet around the world and really making America a global power, though be it a relatively minor one at that point in time. So being in charge of the military was no small feat. Okay. Now, TR, like I said, was convinced wholeheartedly, without a shadow of a doubt, that Taft would continue everything that had been started, and what's more, would continue it in the same way. Now, I mentioned him a few moments ago, and you can think about it. It's very difficult to find someone who not only thinks exactly the same way you do, but would do everything the exact same way you would. That was the problem here. Teddy Roosevelt thought he had found a carbon copy of himself, at least as far as policy goes, but it was not going to be that way. Now, under the Taft administration, one of the issues that came up was that of a tariff. Now, we don't really talk much about tariffs anymore. There has been some talk during the current administration dealing with tariffs in China in particular. But back then, the tariff was really the predominant means through which the United States government got money. There were pretty much only two ways you could look at it. It was either going to be through land sales or it was going to be through a tariff for the longest time. The United States did not always have an income tax. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled the income tax to be unconstitutional when Congress did try to start one. That's why they added the 16th Amendment and created the income tax. So at this point in time, the United States has a number of tariffs. And remember, a tariff is essentially a tax on goods coming into the nation. So we're going to talk for just a little bit about something known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Now, keep in mind that every president that came through at this point in time had their own opinion on tariffs, whether they should exist, should not exist, should they be higher, lower, leave them alone, things like that. But just like everything else in the world, each individual has their own opinion as to what should be done. Now, Taft wanted to go through and wanted to lower tariffs. He thought that by lowering tariffs, this would increase business, it would increase trade, and it would therefore improve the economy. And so he is able to get passed through Congress what's known as the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Now, you think about it, the way our Congress works is you have to have the exact same bill passed in the exact same form in both houses before it goes to the president for a signature. So this was one that required some extra work. Whenever you have two copies of the same bill that aren't 100% the same, it goes to what's known as a conference committee. And in this case, they had to hammer out some differences, and the final version that did get signed into law by the president did lower tariffs, but not very much. It was not the success that Taft had wanted. There's an old saying that says politics is the art of the possible. And in this case, they were able to get something done. It wasn't exactly what the president wanted. It wasn't exactly what members of Congress wanted. But collectively, they were able to go through and hammer out some kind of compromise. And so as a result, yes, Taft did get his wish in that the tariffs were lowered, but they were not going to be lowered by very much. It was not the success he had hoped for. You may recall that under the Teddy Roosevelt administration, we started to see the concept of conservation, the idea that we didn't want to just continuously exploit the natural resources the country had. We came to the realization that they were not unlimited. And so we were trying to find some kind of balance where you could definitely go through and have the joy of going out in the outdoors. Remember, TR was a big outdoorsman, but you also wanted to be able to use the land. And so, unfortunately, during the Taft administration, and this is really part of what led to the break between himself and Teddy Roosevelt, was a dispute over the use of public lands. Okay, now, as I said before, when it comes to progressivism, you have many different styles, is probably the best way to put it. Same thing was true with conservation, the use of these lands. Now, generally speaking, people hear conservation and they think national parks, they think putting land aside and things like that. Now, you might remember we had Gifford Pinchot. Okay, he was head of the U.S. Department of Forestry. Okay, and he wanted to use the land both for public enjoyment and private development. Okay, so part of it was going to be the land would definitely be left pristine or as close as you could, so that way people would have the ability to go to these wild areas to enjoy it, to go camping, fishing, things like that. But he also wanted to be able to use the land for some private development. It was the idea that the economy could not survive without the natural resources being used. Now, to use the land both for public enjoyment and private development would be known as a multi-use land program. Now, when William Taft comes into office, just as is the right of every president, he gets to go through and create his own cabinet. Now, the cabinet are those individuals that are there to, one, advise the president, and two, run the various executive departments. Things like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Education, Secretary at that time of War, etc., things like that. So when William Howard Taft goes through and creates his department, one of the jobs, Secretary of the Interior, is going to be filled by this guy, a gentleman by the name of Richard Ballinger. Now, the Secretary of the Interior is essentially the individual who is in charge of all the public lands, all of the use permits, and things like that. And the thing is that while you do have Pinchot as the head of the Forestry Service, Richard Ballinger is essentially his boss. And the problem is, as is often the case, one does not always agree with the decisions of their boss or their supervisor. And in this case, Secretary Ballinger and Gifford Pinchot really disagreed on land use. Okay, Ballinger wanted more private development. He felt that too much land had been set aside to be kept pristine. He felt that more private use should be underway, that there should be more development of these lands. Now, as a result, you're going to see a fight develop between these two. And what's more, it's going to be public. You're going to see stuff written in the newspapers about it. So it's not like this is a private disagreement between two individuals in government discussing, the actual use of the land. Instead, this is going to be a very public spitting match, is the nicest way to phrase it. Now, Taft has to decide with whom is he going, to side with. Is it going to be his Secretary of the Interior, or is it going to be the head of the Forest Service? He sided with Ballinger and fires Gifford Pinchot. So now there has been a very public break with the programs and the plans and the thoughts of the Teddy Roosevelt administration. So as a result, you're now going to see a very, very public break between the two. Teddy Roosevelt no longer feels that William Howard Taft is going through and actually continuing the way that TR wanted him to. Now, granted, William Howard Taft was the president. He can make the decisions that he wants. Teddy Roosevelt is no longer in charge. He made the decision to follow along with the precedent set by George Washington and only have 2 terms. But in all honesty, TR is beginning to regret that. He feels that Taft is betraying the ideals of the Roosevelt presidency and that everything he had worked for could easily fall apart. And as a result, Teddy Roosevelt is now going to have to start weighing his options as to what he's going to do.